Carl Skinner is a name synonymous with firefighting and forest management in the United States. He began his career as a firefighter in Lassen County in 1968 and went on to become one of the most respected and accomplished scientists in his field. After an illustrious career spanning 42 years with the U.S. Forest Service, Carl retired in 2014, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire those who work in the field of fire science today. Carl Skinner's contributions to the field of fire science are numerous and far-reaching. He is particularly interested in the interplay between fire and climate, and his research in this area has helped to shape our understanding of how wildfires behave and how best to manage them. His work has been instrumental in the development of fire management strategies that are both effective and environmentally sustainable.
Well, hello, I'm Carl Skinner, and I'm a retired research geographer that focused on fire ecology, fire management, and so forth. And then before I got into research with the Forest Service, I actually was in fire management with the Forest Service for quite a number of years. And I am retired now, and we'll be going on with talking about some things that I think might help people to focus on some things with fire when you're trying to do work with them. And learning to live with fire, that's one of the things we need to do in California especially, but throughout the West, because we do have a tendency to burn. And we haven't been very effective at not having that happen. And so we need to learn to live it. It's not if, but when. What type of fire would you like? And the reason I put it that way is that our choices are largely concerning the severity of fire and associated effects that we are willing to accept. Eliminating fire is not one of our choices. Our climate doesn't let us do that. This is California. We live in a fire-promoting climate in a fire-prone landscape that has burned and burned many times through millennia. And we thought we could do better, and obviously we haven't been able to. And so we need to refocus how we think about things. Now, this talk comes largely from questions that people have about the necessity of doing different kinds of fuels treatments. Do you really need to affect the forest this way? Do you really need to do this? Do you need to do that? Because we understand certain things about the forest from reading different things. And part of it comes from this, which is called Insights from Wildfire Science, a resource for policy discussions. It's on the web, and a number of people have pointed this out to me that they get challenged by a lot of this kind of stuff. And so I want to respond to their main points that they make. Place matters is why I want to do this. And it's not, everything doesn't fit the same everywhere. I'm a geographer, that's the science of place. And that's what, so how you interpret things really makes a difference where you are. So, Insights from Wildfire Science, they have several main points they make, and I'll show you what those are, and then I'll go through each one. First one, fire size and frequency will increase under a warming climate. That's climate change, and that we're all experiencing. Fuel reduction on federal lands will do little to reduce acreage burned and homes lost. This is their second point. Not all forests need restoration. Point number 3. Number 4 is high severity fires often have ecological benefits. Number 5, insect outbreaks do not necessarily make fires worse. Land use planning can reduce wildfire risk. Managing more fires to burn safely can reduce risk and increase ecological benefits. Conclusion, learn to live with fire. So, I'm going to go through each one of these as to my take on how it fits in California. Fire size and frequency will increase under a warmer climate. Yes. I mean, all we got to do is see what's happening over the last 20, 30 years, and it's pretty obvious that that is happening. So I have no quarrel with that one at all. More importantly, though, is the probable increase in the frequency of large, severe fires, given the conditions that we're dealing with in many of our landscapes these days. Okay, number 2. Fuel reduction on federal lands will do little to reduce acreage burned and homes lost. I believe that minimizing acres burned is the wrong metric for determining success. That's how we got to where we are with the problems that we have, is minimizing acres burned. What's important is how they burn and creating the conditions that they can burn more similarly to how they may have burned in the past, rather than the severe fires that we're seeing today and such. And then if they're near where people live, they're near homes and that kind of thing, then if you've changed the condition of the forest to where it burns more similarly to the past, they're easier to deal with so that you don't threaten the homes and such as much. So that's my take on that one. I think that the amount of acres that burn severely should be taken down each year compared to the amount of acres that don't. And this affects watersheds, it'll affect the soils, affects wildlife habitat, vegetation. The whole thing is all based on how they burn is really important. And the fires that move from community to community, and that's what threatens homes. So here is a fire that we had, and this was at the Blacks Mountain Experimental Forest in 1992. And can't blame it on me because I was in Ohio when it happened, and for another project. But what's interesting about it, you can see there's definitely some patterns there as to what was happening in this landscape. What we have is these areas where there's lots of white ash immediately after the fire. It was flown to get a idea of what the fire did, and you can see those were severely burned areas. They weren't thinned. They had not had any fuels treatments. And by the way, this line right here is the edge of the experimental forest. This area up here is general forest, and some of it's even private. And then this is the experimental forest area down here. And then we have this area where we thinned it and followed the thinning with prescribed fire. This area had been thinned in the early 1980s, and with really very little follow-up on fuels, managing the fuels, but it was quite a while ago, and probably a lot of the fuels had decomposed by that time. So what I did was to go to the edge of this treatment unit. And these treatment units, by the way, were about 150 to 200 acres in size overall that we had. And we had quite a number of them across the forest in different ways. And I stood on the edge and, facing where the fire came from, took a photograph to show you what it looked like the results of the fire were coming at us. And then I turned around 180 degrees and took a photograph looking into the area that we had treated with thinning and prescribed fire to show you how the fire had affected it. And so that's where the fire came from. You can see there's no green in there. Everything's pretty much dead. And then just turn around, standing in the same spot, and you see this. And it crossed into the area where we had done thinning, followed by prescribed fire, and the fire dropped to the ground immediately, and actually had a hard time getting through there. And you can see that it just scorched some of the lower limbs, but that the trees largely survived the fire. Look at this one. Says fuel reduction in federal lands will do little to reduce acreage burns and homes lost. Well, actually, there's other things that go on too. Look at all this. This is ladder fuels, and this stuff will eventually burn. Actually, this area, this did burn. In 2021 in the Monument Fire, this is over near Hayfork. And I haven't been back to see what it looks like now, but I've been told it doesn't look very good. And, but this stuff is all going to burn. And one of the things that we can do with stuff like this is put it into these things and generate power, do something with it. It's going to burn anyway. And some people say, well, you shouldn't do that because it's going to reduce, it'll emit carbon. It's been doing that for millennia. I mean, on and on and on. These areas burn, the vegetation here burns, and that's part of the background. That's not necessarily the problem that we have today. The problem we have today is this stuff that would not burn except that we extract it and burn it on top of all of this other stuff. And the more of the other that you work with, the less of this you have to do. So it's another way of thinking about dealing with fuels over the broad term in the landscape. Another thing that is we get used to scenes that look like this. This is the river going through Redding and such, but it doesn't always look like that. You get this too. And this is August 13th, 2018 during the Carr Fire. And this had been going on for almost 2 months by this time, or well over a month anyway, not 2 months. And you can just see just smoke, 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 and people have to breathe that. And if it's being managed in such a way as you don't necessarily get these huge pulses of smoke at one time, you get it more metered as to how it is produced and gone. So there's another thing that fuel reduction on federal lands can do to reduce the effects of the fires that we're experiencing. Okay, not all forests need restoration. Yeah, I'm sure there are places that don't need restoration. That's true, but they actually give an exception on their website and in the paper they published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And that exception is where it's increased and more continuous fuel loads have shifted fires from past frequent low intense severity to present day high severity events. Well, that's California. That's exactly what's happened here. We are that exception. And forests, woodlands, savannas, valley, whatever, basically we fit the exception is what we have. And so, yeah, you can find places that don't need restoration, but they're pretty rare in California. Place matters. Not all forests need restoration. Now this is from Lassen Park. It's where when they first set the park up, they went to every corner of every square mile and put plots in and described the vegetation, took photographs in the 4 cardinal directions so they could record what Lassen Park looked like in the early 1920s when they were setting up the park. And my colleague Alan Taylor went back in the early 1990s to document how the forest had changed in that about 70 years worth of time of trying to put fires out and climate changing and everything else. And this is the same place, standing in the same place, looking in the same direction, taking the photograph. And you can see how this forest has changed dramatically from what it once was. And so if what you want is something that's more original or something that would survive the fires coming through, it probably needs to look a little more like this than this. Because this one's going to burn this way, most likely, and that one will burn that way. And it probably did when the Dixie Fire went through. Okay, high severity fires often have ecological benefits. Now, I'm not sure how often that is, but it depends on which part of the ecosystem you're thinking about, and so forth. You can focus in on different things, but positive effects versus negative effects. There might be some positive effects, but how does that get weighed against the negative effects that you get and such? And it's like, it depends on many factors, especially spatial scales and context. Place matters. And basically, where along this continuum of from low severity to high severity is a lot of the landscape and the fires after it goes through. And so, yeah, this is true, but it needs to be weighed against other elements of the ecosystem in different landscapes as to what is the result of the fires. This is a paper just published by Kimberly Davis and 62 other authors. Basically what they did was they brought together data from all over the western United States in looking at how forests were recovering from fires. Alan Taylor sent this to me because he's one of the authors on this paper. And it's amazing. And basically what they did was they look at modeling actually climate change out into the future as well, looking at how fires, the effects of fires changed from, say, the 1970s to the 1990s to the 20s, and then where they're likely going. And they're finding that the forests are definitely losing resilience, to the ability to recover very well from fires and throughout. And it's basically, it's a very detailed paper, and what's interesting about it is it's a number of the authors are the same ones that put this other thing together before they did this study. Insect outbreaks do not necessarily make fires worse. Well, if you've got a place that looks like this is in the McLeod Flats, after insects went through and killed an awful lot of the trees, and now they've died and fallen over and are accumulating as fuel. And compare that to the Beaver Creek Pinery, where fires go through every so often and clean it up. I can guarantee you that this is going to burn a whole lot more severely than this area is. And I don't think you need to say a whole lot more. I mean, that's really going to burn. And I don't know what you mean by worse, but yes. Land use planning can reduce wildfire risk. Land use planning can reduce the risk of large destructive wildfires. And this is kind of looking across scales, and it takes interagency planning to do this. This is the wildlands, the Shasta Trinity. This is Mount Shasta, and this is the Wooey Rainbow Ridge area, and then you get into the neighborhoods and homes scattered in here. And so it takes a lot of interaction across the different agencies and stuff to be able to plan for a landscape like this. That, yeah, you might be able to just do something really severe around houses and neighborhoods, but the landscape itself, there is a big lake over here on the other side of Rainbow Ridge that has a lot of recreation in it. And it wouldn't take much to get fires going over there and rip over the ridge with the right kinds of winds and come on into town. So the broader landscape does take planning, and you could make it so that it's less likely to do a lot of damage to folks here, as well as protect the landscape. Managing more fires to burn safely can reduce risk and increase ecological benefits. I agree. Gradient of choices. Well, there's doing nothing. There's thinning, but no dealing with the surface fuels. And then there's thinning and dealing with surface fuels. And there's what that ended up looking like. That's what that looked like after the fire went through. And there's how that one looked. And this was the same fire, burned in the same afternoon through each of these. So yeah, I agree with that. Fire and climate change. Where are we headed? Fire season is getting longer. That's one thing that's been pretty well demonstrated. We know that it's increased by 70 to 90 days per year since 1970, the average fire season. But the fuels keep growing. What that does is makes a greater probability of intense fires. We have more fuel, plus we have longer fire seasons that make it more likely that areas are going to burn. It increases the probability of burning. It's not a question of if, but when is the fire going to happen. It's pretty much physics. It's the fire triangle: heat, oxygen, and fuel. And the more heat we have with fire season getting longer, with the increasing heat and drying that's associated with that, oxygen's there, and the fuel keeps increasing. And so we have this situation setting up for things to just get worse if we don't do something to manage it. Conclusion: learning to live with fire is what we need to do. And there are different ways to live with fire. We can just kind of take what throws at us and keep going down the same road we've been going down, or we can try to change it. And I love this. This is Sierra de San Pedro Martir National Park in Baja California. And this is what much of the park looks like. It's a huge national park up in the mountains of Baja. And they started fire suppression just a couple of decades ago. They weren't doing that up to that point. So you can see their forests haven't changed a lot, except in certain places that are a little bit more productive. And then they decided to update their forest management, their fire management plan. And so they invited several of us to come down and work with them on updating their fire management plan. And this is the fellow that invited us. He's a professor at the university in Ensenada. And then this is the director of the national park. And then this is Jan van Wagendonk, Hugh Safford, Scott Stevens. He's from UC Berkeley. Hugh is with UC Davis and Vibrant Planet now. And he was with Forest Service. And then Jan was longtime fire scientist in the Sierra Nevada. He passed away since this. And then I took the picture. I was down there with him working on it. And the thing that I thought was interesting is that I asked Iram, is this fellow's name, his name, I says, what made you want to redo your fire management plan for this park? And he said, we started fire suppression and we were going a certain direction. And he says, but we watch CNN, we see what's happening to you guys, and we don't want to go down the same road. I thought, oh, cool. And so it was interesting to go down and work with them. So we have choices. What type of fire would you like?